Well, welcome everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today for the first of our conversations about the impact of COVID-19 on regional Australia and how we can best manage it. We're pleased to report that we've been fully subscribed for this timely initiative. And so it's great to have everyone along. We've got over 95 participants, so welcome to all of you. Unfortunately, it won't be possible to have people actually talk during our panel discussion. However, there's a chat box down the bottom, and can I really encourage you to use this to have input both in terms of questions and information about your own circumstances. And I'll do my best to feed those questions into the conversation as it goes along. We already have a pool of questions that people sent in as a result of our email, and we'll try and answer some of those at any rate. But what we will do is look at that pool of questions that you've sent, along with any that arise during today's session, and we'll use that to inform our next week's discussion. We'll have another discussion on Tuesday in this rapidly unfolding crisis. So I please encourage you to use the chat box on the bottom right-hand corner, both in terms of questions, but also information about your own circumstances. And we'll also review all the comments and issue a communique early next week that captures the recording of this this particular discussion. And we're also recording it, and it will be available, the recording will be available on the SEGRA website later today. So as this pandemic races around the world and Australian state and territory governments act to address an unfolding situation, SEGRA wanted to provide a forum where people who work and live and invest in regional Australia could advance the issues impacting on rural, regional and remote Australia. A lot of the discussions at the moment are very big picture and looking at industrial relations models, for example, that don't actually operate in a lot of regional Australia. And so we just wanted to provide this forum so that we could advance issues impacting on regional, rural and remote Australia. For those who aren't familiar with SEGRA, it's more formally known as Sustainable Economic Growth for Regional Australia, and was established more than 20 years ago to ensure a voice for regional Australia. SEGRA is committed to assisting regional, rural and remote Australia to source and identify the techniques, skills and issues they need to address to achieve successful economic growth and development. SEGRA has had a long-standing commitment to the link between government policy and place, what happens on the ground, and are acutely aware of the need for our ideas to be well tailored to varying place-based needs of our many regional communities. Many of you will be familiar with the Regional Solutions Framework that I have been collaborating on with Robert Prestipino for the last 5 years. And when he approached me about facilitating a regional discussion looking for solutions to best bring our best ideas to the table, we thought a facilitated discussion could be the best way to showcase the varying issues spread across regional Australia, and hence today's panel discussion. The idea of this panel discussion is to assist in bringing together key issues and opportunities while hearing firsthand from people tackling the impacts of COVID-19 in regional Australia. These impacts will be across health, the broader economy, education, business, lifestyle and well-being, to name a few. In these conversations, we intend to offer over the next few weeks, we'll give regions the chance to take the initiative and control of their own economic development destinies, develop innovative strategies and implementation processes to manage the COVID-19, and identify key decision makers, processes and points of access in government and the corporate sector to engage with. So Robert, tell us a bit more about your thinking on this issue.
Yes, Kate. No, it's interesting. You know, the work we've been doing for a number of years now is trying to find a better way of connecting policy down to place in regional Australia. And part of that sort of design thinking process and bringing our creativity to it is really context is really important. And it's clear that there is a broad regional context that's going to be very different from urban-based initiatives. And not only that, even the local context. And I think before the whole COVID-19 solutions and process starts, we need to, I suppose, just pause and see what we're coming out of, because I'm based in the regions. We'll have personal stories, and I'm on a rural property that's 30 kilometres north of Toowoomba. October last year, we've got adjustment cattle. There was no water, driest it's been in 15 years. They were taken off. November, I don't know if you guys remember the Great Peachy bushfire in Queensland, ran for 2 weeks. Well, it started behind our house. It was deliberately lit. It literally, our house nearly burnt down. The fire burnt to the door. Our house was only saved by the fireys, literally in a 10, 15-minute window. And we learnt a lot about vehicle access, space, and our whole community up here. I think we only lost about 3 houses. They say it's $35 million worth of damage through that fire. But I know also our community up here was embarrassed and felt guilty when we saw what was happening further south through December, January. They're just horrific bushfire issues and what the people have lost. And I think the messaging in this is really important, because I'm standing here today from our Home Office contributing because our house didn't burn down. But I think, our messaging about, go home and work online may not be quite fit with people who actually have had their houses and businesses recently burnt to the ground. And that's just part of the regional communities. And, we've had the rain in February to put it out, and we're sort of coming out of that, and COVID-19 comes along. And again, we've all got personal stories, because right at the moment, our 24-year-old son's in transit back to Australia. We hope he will land in Perth this afternoon. We hope to pick him up from the airport, Brisbane Airport, at 6 o'clock tomorrow. He was working in Norway for 6 months. The place shut down. We said, you better get back quickly. So this week's been a little bit stressful. But again, even this is interesting about how that impacts, because he will arrive and he'll come home to the 14-day self-isolation. It's compulsory. And that's not an issue, but it's interesting that, my wife's a high school teacher, and the official position is, unless my son has symptoms, she's to go to work. She works at a public high school with 1,700 kids in a crowded campus. Don't know how they do social distancing there, but to keep our schools open. And it's interesting, and this is where I think we start looking at the different layers. Well, we need a conversation across all these sectors, because, and not saying, because we don't know what's right or wrong at the moment. There's a lot of initiatives. No one's been through this before. There's discussions about keeping kids in school when we know the young people are potentially the potential spreaders of it. And we also know our teaching demographic are baby boomers. They're 50 in the 60s, and they're exposed to 1,700 kids, where at the same time, a gathering of 100 adults is too many and too dangerous. So, and again, that's an issue. And, from a regional perspective, there's things about, particularly a lot of remote rural parents have their kids in boarding schools. The potential idea when they're still open, so when those kids go back, do we unintentionally accelerate the transmission back into our regional communities from our urban boarding schools? And we know in regional Australia, we've got a high age demographic, and that's unique to regional Australia, and they're some of the most vulnerable. So you can see with all these things about, no one really knows yet what's right or wrong, but everything's really interconnected. And I think before we're so at the front end of this, before we're thinking about solutions, even in policy or application, we need this sort of conversation that's broad across regions. Everyone's got different focuses, different issues, different perspectives. And I think some of those perspectives will be uniquely regional, that in a sense, you would have all heard the metaphor yesterday of building a bridge, which I think is a particularly good metaphor. But I think our challenge is, well, what's the regional bridge? What's the bridge for regional Australia to take us through this, out the other end that we thrive? And I'm sure it will need a bit of a different design emphasis or policy or focus. And I think before we run into the design of that bridge, let's have this conversation and identify all the areas that we'll need to trade off, balance, but at least let us be transparent about the sort of trade-offs we'll have to do. So I think this conversation earlier is so important, and I know you and I really want to encourage a broad section of ideas and interests to be brought to these sessions and be guided by people's chat and input to guide the sort of conversations and information we can gather. So in that context, I think it's an interesting time, a good time to move and have conversations, and it's great to be kicking this off today.
Great. Thanks, Robert. Well, Tony, I might invite you into the conversation now. You're the Executive Officer of the Limestone Coast Local Government Association and also a graduate of the highly regarded JMW Leader of the Future program, as well as holding a Master of Enterprise. Tell us what's happening in your region in regard to COVID-19 and what do you see as the key issues or impacts for your region?
Yeah, thanks, Kate. I'm also a director of the AC Care Board, which works with some of the most vulnerable people in our community as well. So I guess when I look at what's happening across our region, I see this as a bit of a strategy challenge because of the rate of change. And if you think about strategy, it will generally fail when you can't match the rate of change. And so you either pull the lever too early or you pull the lever too late. And strategy will only consistently work with adaptation if you can match that rate. And we don't know what the rate is. And even within our region, we've got different rates of change because we've got some big centres and some small centres. Limestone Coast region, for those of you who don't know, it's on the Victorian border on the South Australian side between Adelaide and Melbourne. And so what we're seeing with, even with our councils, Mount Gambier, for instance, which is the largest centre, has taken a whole range of initiatives, particularly at the council level, where they're starting to close off customer-facing activities, whereas other communities which are smaller haven't done that. So I think that's the biggest challenge. How do we manage that rate of change? And obviously that plays into how do we limit the impact on our hospitals and health services. And in regional centres, we have an advantage because we're generally sparsely populated, spread out, and possibly have a greater opportunity to slow down that rate. But also our systems, the downside is our health systems are probably not as don't have the capacity of the metro area as well. In our communities, we have some communities that are quite wealthy and have almost zero unemployment, and we've got other communities where there's high unemployment and some really socially disadvantaged people. One of the things that jumps out for me is this idea of digital isolation in regional communities, and particularly for vulnerable people in regional communities. And we're starting to think about, that'll become really a critical issue, I think, because as people become socially isolated, if they're already digitally isolated, then they're going to be extremely vulnerable, particularly if this plays out for any period of time. And it's fantastic, some of the initiatives that the federal government and state governments are putting in place, but often you can't access those benefits unless you've got good connectivity and digital literacy and capacity to access digitally. And I did notice in Mount Gambier, which is one of the largest centres in this area, they've effectively, I think there's only one store still selling webcams as an example of the run on digital technology now that we're starting to see. In terms of, did you want me to go into the sort of impacts we're seeing locally? So in terms of impacts for us, picking up Robert's comments where he said how his community felt a bit almost guilty they weren't affected by fires, we're in a similar position because we have excellent water supplies. Land prices have gone up here by 45% in the last 18 months. We haven't been affected by drought. We are surrounded by 20% of the nation's softwood forest, so we were quite nervous during the fires, but apart from a reasonably significant grass fire, we avoided the impact of fires. They're happening all around us, Kangaroo Island and in Victoria. So we came out of that with record prices for our product, land prices going up. Now the virus has hit. We've seen our lobster prices collapsing. So we've got fishermen who were expecting to have significant incomes from China. That's not happening. We've cancelled all of our events basically in the region. And to give you an example of the impact of that, we cancelled just 4 events, means 60,000 less people coming into our community. What's the dollar value of that? Well, to give you a benchmark, we had Triple J one night stand here about 6 months ago. That was about 20,000 people, and they injected about 20 million into the economy. So it's a significant hit. The export markets to China for fibre, obviously almost down to zero, but still high demand for meat products and those types of things. Like most communities, we've had, so tourism for us is also a significant player in our economy, and we've worked really hard to increase our visitation rates internationally and interstate, and over the last 3 years have increased that by 30%. In fact, we're the second most visited location in South Australia for international and interstate visitors. We have a number of tourist businesses that are 100% reliant on international visitation. So they're all going into, I guess, shutdown mode, and a number of them don't really understand how they're going to survive this period of time. So today's announcement with the banks, which Rod was telling us about before, and other initiatives are going to be critical, trying to sustain that economic capability in the region. Like a lot of communities, we've had a run on products in our shops. Ironically, Millicent ran out of toilet paper early. Millicent is where Kimberley-Clark is, where they make most of the toilet paper for the country. But of course, it gets dispatched from Adelaide, so they ran out of toilet paper. I guess one of the concerning things is some of our smaller communities have been quite level-headed and sensible when it comes to panic buying. But what's happened is they've been ransacked by neighbouring communities, where busloads of people have descended on some of these small towns, and suddenly the supermarket's been sold out of a product. So I think that's a bit of a concerning development, I think, particularly when you've got one regional community and another regional community. In terms of what we've done, we've shut down our sports academy. We've limited face-to-face meetings. We've stopped people coming into the region for work if they can do it remotely. Pretty well what everyone else is doing.
Look, thanks very much for that, Tony. I might bring Rod into the conversation now. Rod's the co-founder of Community Broadband Networks based in Geelong, but for 12 years Rod served as a councillor and deputy mayor of the city of Greater Geelong, and during that time he held a range of portfolios including planning, economic development, knowledge economy, education and major projects and veterans affairs. So thanks very much, Rod, for joining us today, and perhaps you could talk a little bit about the impacts of coronavirus in your region, and what strategies people have been taking up.
Yeah, thanks, Kate. I think we're pretty much here in Geelong reflective of what's happening around the nation. We like to see Geelong as being a regional centre at times, and at others it becomes a major city. So it's sort of on the border where we have rural as well as sort of city sort of populations. Probably within the city of Geelong itself, one of the biggest impacts I think has been the limits of crowd numbers and events. We saw the 500 number originally a couple of weeks ago, and then since that time it's been dropped down to 100, and with that went a lot of activities and events. For example, pools are shut now, gyms are shut, larger dinners, conferences, meetings amongst various companies where there's a number of people present. They are the sort of venues, maybe multiple venues, where you've, say, had a conference centre, there's gaming areas, restaurants, bulk centres. They are now coming under pressure. So, you see the streets very, very quiet. Parking spaces is having a major impact, and it will continue. And I guess I was sort of reflecting on it this morning, looking at just before Christmas, we were we'd seen interest rates over the past 5-6 years start coming down, and the economy really hadn't kick-started at all. And with a lot of cash going out of the economy, it was getting tight and demand was dropping. So we came into this coronavirus period, pandemic, with a weakened economy, I guess. And so challenge now, and we've seen federal governments and states now rally to try and drive that demand and get things happening again. But it really is, I guess, concern. And but the only thing we can do is really push ahead and look for opportunities. So I guess you've got to take an optimistic view that things are outside our control, but there are people who've now put measures in place which will minimise that disruption in the longer term. Because obviously, if we can get this under control, we've all heard the health warnings that there'll be more lives saved, etc. And we need to pursue that. So with that in mind, I guess it's how do we respond as a local community? And one of the things I've seen over the past few days, particularly, is the local business groups we've had here in Geelong, the Geelong Chamber of Commerce, working alongside the Victorian Chamber of Commerce and Industry. They have been conducting various webinars utilising the expertise of accountants, the Chamber itself, online web marketing companies, technology companies. We've heard a little bit about the IT and internet connectivity. So these guys can help advise people about how they can get online, and we've also had health professionals, GPs, involved in those webinars to help employers, in particular in this case, to understand the risks, how to mitigate and keep business going. We've also just seen, and Tony just mentioned a moment ago, probably just over an hour ago, Anna Bligh made an announcement that all the banks are now implementing a small business loan relief package, where small businesses are impacted by the virus pandemic just need to register with the bank and they'll be fast-tracked for support. This loan relief really, I think, is looking at deferral of payments for up to 6 months. So it's going to have a significant impact and allow businesses to not worry about having immediate payments, and they can help put their business plans in place. And I think on that, we to look at the continuity of business and also our society, we need to be looking at our contingency planning and basically expect change and be adaptable, because we've already seen over the past few weeks how rapidly the restrictions happen. And I've seen this at first hand, as whilst I live in Geelong, we also operate a business in Tasmania, accommodation business. So we were not full up, but we had quite a reasonable bookings for over Easter. And when Tasmania announced the shutdown and the quarantine for 14 days, our calendars were emptied out. So we're just one of many. But so that's a challenge that, okay, we've now got to look at sustainability in the long term, and we don't know what that period will be. And each business is facing that same challenge. But I think assessing your local resources, looking at what you're able to, the expertise in your local communities, working together, I think, and that's going to be a key.
Okay, thanks, Rod. And I guess one of the take-home messages I get from this is that it's strategically managing something where the rate of change is so rapid and the need to adapt is so rapid. I might just throw in here, and we've got a list of resources on our website, which I'll talk about later, but the Chartered Practicing Accountants, the CPA, have put out a guide for small businesses to prepare for COVID-19, and they're quite useful suggestions like update your financial statements, list possible impacts on your business, estimate the financial impact, develop mitigation strategies, perform a financial health check, redo your budgets with new assumptions, and act now to improve cash flow. And for each of those, they've got some templates and some quite good suggestions, and that may be useful for businesses in regions that are struggling. Robert, over to you now. You might look at more closely at the impact on people.
Yeah, I've got a question for Tony. What are your thoughts about, I know we're early phases in relief, but what about solo practitioners, casual workers, the whole gig economy? There's a lot of people that aren't in small business, and they have even less cash flows, but they have debts as well.
Yeah.
What's your thoughts in your area about that segment of your sort of economy?
Well, so particularly in the Limestone Coast, we have a lot of small businesses, often sole traders, and I think it's a group that's a bit of a backbone of our community. I've got to show my own hand here. I've got a daughter who's a musician who supplements her uni income, and she's just lost all her income now for the next 6 months. So I think, yeah, definitely. I mean, I know there's already support out there for businesses with a turnover of less than 50 million and they're classed as sort of medium-sized businesses. I think the classification of business sizes as they relate to regional centres probably needs to be looked at because what we call a small business or a medium-sized business might be quite different in a metro context. But yeah, I think we need to look very carefully at these sole traders, sole practitioners, 2 or 3 up to 5 sort of person organisations, and how do we support them through the process, and more importantly, probably how do we help them stay socially connected with their peers and with the markets, so that their mental health is sustained as well, because I think mental health is probably after economic, mental health is the biggest challenge we're going to have with our communities as we come through this.
Yeah, I mean, good point, Tony, because even interesting, with the bushfire season, what struck me was the trauma from fire is way worse than flood or cyclone, and the way it sticks with people. And then you bring this on top of that, and those fires really happened in the regional communities, not urban communities. So that, I think mental health issues, I was worried just coming out of the fire season, what mental health issues for regional Australia would be like. Put this on top, I think it's a topic for sure. Rod, similar question to you, because I know Geelong's about startups and innovation and everything, but that's all small scale and capital raising. And do you have any thoughts on that, on what they might need, or just your views at the moment around that topic of micro size?
It's interesting because that probably in a different world, when you're a small, like a startup, you're really in the situation where you've got a great idea and you've got not a lot of income coming in, and so it's always hard work getting established. And I think when we have a situation like this where your potential customer base drops right away, it provides a huge amounts of challenges. And it's going to be ongoing, I think. So whatever we do to respond needs to take the bigger picture view and look at sustainability in the long run, or at least in the medium term. Yes, so it will vary between businesses for sure, but it's a significant impact on their sustainability at the early days.
Crises of this type are becoming the new norm, and it was somewhat sobering to read a report that was written in January 2019 reflecting on the Spanish flu and saying that we would have a pandemic sometime in the next year. So I guess I'm hearing that this is the new normal, and that we need to be working to build resilience in the community, particularly being aware of the vulnerable people, which are older people in particular, and as well as our businesses, from the micro to the big. I mean, no one could have predicted that Qantas would stand down 20,000 staff. That's a significant impact. The other area, I suppose, that I'm wondering how the impacts are going to be felt is in backpackers from overseas, whether or not they're going to be stuck here, or whether or not our supply of people who can pick fruit, etc., is being covered in the government responses at the moment.
Kate, can I just come in here? You're sort of talking about a change, and I think that, to me, is probably one of the things we probably don't know to the extent of it. But after this event, when it's over, there's going to be a lot of major changes. There'll be some structural changes, the way we do business, the expectations. It's the fact that things were forced on us. There will be innovations come out of this. And I just think particularly around where people see the importance of online. Now, I know within SEGRA, we've talked about this for the last decade and how we need a really strong and high capacity internet system for the whole country, because governments are moving to that, private industries moving to that. And I think what we see here is that a lot of people are going to work from home. There's been issues around connectivity, and so the demand there, I think, all of a sudden, this will put a focus on that and make people realise that this is actually critical moving forward. And so I know, for example, our internet company actually extended data. They took off all their data caps, and they said, we'll leave that off until the end of April and we'll review it then. But there's a recognition, and it was mentioned that people were now working from home, and we've seen a lot of businesses move their, Telstra being one, but others as well, move their employees to work from home, which again, they need to have other considerations. But to be able to do that, you need the internet, and regional areas traditionally have suffered because of poor internet. And I think that's just one thing, but I think out of it, we need to really put the pressure on our system and governments to ensure that this capacity is rolled out, because yes, we need to adapt for a future and have the plan so that whatever happens next, we can cover it and move on.
I was just reflecting on the conversations, and I reckon there are sort of three key themes that are coming out of this. I think one is around how do we sustain social fabric in our regional communities. Another one is how do we sustain and retain economic capability. And then I think the third one is, which is sort of what Rod was touching on, but as the money and investments free up and become available for investment, we really have to have a strong focus on how do we build economic capability. And building economic capability means building infrastructure, building digital, physical capability, which means the economy can actually take advantage of that and grow once we come out of this. So in my mind, there's sort of those three themes. One's about sustaining social fabric, one's about sustaining and hanging on to economic capability, and then investing right now to build greater economic capability, mainly through infrastructure. And of course, that cash will then flow into the economy as well.
Yeah, I think that enabling infrastructure is a key. It's what will drive the future opportunities. And so I think from a government point of view, looking at it, the situation, it won't be long, I don't think, before the infrastructure plans get brought forward. But let's look at the infrastructure investment that actually is contributing to the future, so we don't just fix up old problems or old buildings or whatever. We actually put infrastructure in place that's actually going to take communities forward, and particularly in the regions. That's one area that we've, again, it's a SEGRA topic for year after year, is the investment in the regions will drive those regions, give them an opportunity to develop their competitive advantages and provide economic opportunities, employment, etc., out in the bush and the region. So I think that's something that that needs to be considered at the highest level when these decisions are made.
With just a question, I suppose, for Tony and Rod, just drilling down from that, and you've sort of alluded to potentially some consumer and client behavioural change, and some, they're already saying overseas some businesses may not exist. The structure will change, that because of consumer behaviour will change at the end of this. The notion of delivering services and other things. And I just feel for a lot of businesses, regional businesses, small businesses that have just been blindsided by this. What are your thoughts about the extent of potential change they have to go to be profitable at the other side of this bridge? Because you said it's not going to be the same, but those guys must be wondering, well, what do we do? How do we understand the change coming?
So I think you're dead right, but I think it's going to be much broader than just that, because I think every firm will be thinking about their risk profile with their supply chain, and they'll be thinking about where critical products are made. They'll be thinking about how do they sustain their own operations going forward. So there's going to be a change in consumer behaviour, which regional businesses will need to really think through and make sure they're not lagging behind, hopefully leading, but not lagging behind. But I think also open up the mind to the supply chain opportunities that are going to emerge from this, because I think firms are going to look to diversify their risk. I think they'll look to have, rather than one big supplier in a remote location, they'll be looking to have combinations. And so they'll, so I think that whole thinking about logistics and supply chain risk creates an opportunity for us. But we need to be starting to think about that now, so that we're actually preparing for it and seeking out those opportunities as we start coming out of the current environment.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point, because what this has done, especially with the China closed down, it's sort of broken that paradigm in business. So we just get China to build everything for us and we do just-in-time ordering. And there's this push to local sourcing. So I think for the regional Australia, there could be some opportunities in looking at your potential to contribute to local supply chains, as you're suggesting, as purely as a risk management thing, as you're saying. That's going to be really interesting.
One thing, Rob,
I've got a comment. Sorry, Rod.
The diversification, I think that's going to be, and the supply chain sort of management is critical. And the old principle of Kanban, where just in time, we operate that too with our fuel. So you can see that once we have these links broken, that we're in trouble. And I think that needs to be reassessed. It's always been the most efficient, but is it always going to be effective if we can't get it? So I think that will cause a reassessment, and the capacity of a particular skilled company as well to manufacture products perhaps they didn't traditionally get involved with, but they have the engineering and the capacity to actually adapt to do something as well. So I think it's that diversification and broadening of product offering, and even within a small business, what can you do that spreads your market share across a broader market and allow you to compete, and also help you have some sort of protection, I guess balancing your risk across your market sectors. So that'll be, I think, a common topic around small businesses, and people like the Chamber of Commerce and Industry, those guys, they'll be looking at that as a topic. And just to note that I'm sure all the other chambers have, but Victoria, VCCI has an employer guide to handle this current crisis, and it's about 20 pages, and it just goes through each of the aspects of your businesses and how to respond, so including health. So I think there'll be a lot of reflection coming out of this, and I know there's businesses out there now looking to even diversify in how they service and even put things more online. So there's some interesting change coming, and we can only speculate what some of that is.
Yes. Well, listen, look, thank you very much, Rod and Tony and Robert. We're close on time now, and I just want to put through a couple of things from the chat room. One from Stephen Hibbert, who says, I think we need to be looking at coping strategies, mechanisms, and give the community support and confidence to get through. As I see at the moment, it's a day-by-day proposition. We've certainly touched a lot on the vulnerable people in the community. And the other area that is the two resources that Rod and I have talked about. If you go onto the SEGRA website, we've in the latest news section of the website under the general button, we've put together some useful websites, which includes those two documents for people to access. Another idea we have had is from Peter in the local Limestone coast, saying, I wonder what lessons we can learn from the humanitarian migrants that now call Australia home and how their communities have adapted to the crisis. So listen, thank you all very much for joining us today. Please keep the conversation going. If you'd like to contact me directly, my email is kate@segra.com.au or robert@vitalplaces.com.au. And please keep this conversation going. Med has just added the link in the chat box to that part of the web. Thanks everyone very much for your participation, and we intend, just as we've said that this is happening day by day, we intend to have these conversations about twice a week. So the next one will be at 11 o'clock next Tuesday, and we'll be looking to get some panellists who are particularly informed on resilience and also on perhaps the chartered practicing accountants to get their viewpoints on what local businesses can do, because that's been a strong thought. So look, thanks very much everyone, and I look forward to you being part of the conversation next week.
All right, thanks, Kate.
Yeah.
Thanks, Kate.